So if you look behind me, you'll notice that everything behind me is very monotonous, or what I like to refer to as monozone. And matter of fact, I'm back, about 2.5 miles here. And this goes on for another 1.5 miles, literally in each direction. And I used to call this garbage land because when you would come back to these particular types of areas, you'd be like, where do you set up? This is kind of garbage, because we know that deer and big bucks in particular like to always be in the edge, right? Now, some ways you could look at this and just say this is just one huge bedding area, which in some ways it is true too. But from a bow hunting perspective, especially on public land, these particular areas become very good as the season progresses. And the reason that is that because these areas look like garbage to everybody else. Everybody nowadays has a phone, and for the most part, I'm guessing 90% of the hunters that walk in the woods have hunting apps or maps, Onyx, Hunt Stand, whatever it might be, and they're looking at points, they're looking at edges, so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, in a previous public land video that I talk about, I would say looking for trifectas. And when I'm looking for these trifectas, what they are is, pardon me folks, these mosquitoes are horrendous back here. These trifectas are areas where 3 different topographies come together. So in a sense, I'm kind of going against what I mentioned over there, but you have to look at it from a different point of view, or essentially in a lot of cases, a large buck's point of view. When these areas that all look good to everybody else, people go into these spots, hunt them, and then these bucks at night when they're traveling, they're picking up human scent over and over again. And they remember where people set up, especially if it's multiple people setting up and they pick up different human scent. And they start to get to these areas where people just don't go. And this is a classic example of the spot that I'm in, actually. I'm gonna be honest with you, I've never seen a trail camera back here. I've never seen a person back here, and I've never seen even a stand hung back here, and this is public land. But it's just a bear to get to, and because it's a swamp, these mosquitoes are horrendous for most of the early season here in Wisconsin, at least. But these monozones can be very, very effective, because as that outside pressure gets greater throughout the bow hunting season, it essentially pushes these bigger bucks into these particular areas. These bucks feel safe back here. And, when they're walking around doing their evening thing, they're not coming across human scent. They're very safe back here. And that's why these bucks like these monozones, or if you like to call it, like I used to call it, garbage land, all right? So now let's go over on how to hunt these particular monozones. So this particular piece of property, everything is fairly the same. However, there are these little spots where we got cedar points, we got some tamarack that do come out, and they make these little spots within this big, huge swamp. And what happens is whenever you have these spots of tamarack or cedar, at least in this particular swamp, the doe families like to travel the length, okay, for the most part, of the tamarack or the cedars. And then what happens around that pre-rut time frame, from what I've noticed hunting in these areas, and as well as trail camera footage, is that these bucks like to go and cross trail them, and they usually hit them at these points where these cedars or tamaracks or pine, whatever it might be, that little something that's different that creates a little bit of an edge. Wherever you get these points in here, okay, these bucks like to cross trail, and then they'll hit it on a T intersection and try to catch does, especially during that pre-rut rut time frame, to see if any does are in heat at that time. So from that perspective, what you're looking for, at least what I look for anyways, is I'm looking for edges, and then where these edges create a point. Over my right shoulder is the cedar point, and then it's kind of just peters out into the monozone, or essentially swamp. If you do look behind me though, it's kind of hard to tell, but I do have just a couple of cedar trees there. So once again, these does come out of the island, they take the lengthwise of the island down, and then these bucks will actually just come right out of the monozone, and they catch this point. Now, one of the things I want to point out is if you look behind me, there are no trails here. So a lot of people will come back here. Well, I didn't say come back here. They don't come back here. But what they do, they look at an area like this. If they would come back here and they don't see any deer sign. Matter of fact, there's no rubs. There's nothing over here. And there's no trails. But just from hunting here in the past, I know that these bucks like to come and catch this particular spot and catch the edge of it. So that's another advantage to you. If you can recognize these little points that stick out in these monozones and then set up accordingly, that can be an advantage to you, because these are these little things that you have to learn or start learning how to recognize on how deer use a particular spot or a particular area. And this is a great spot. Had a big boy back here last year. Had my camera, that camera about 100 yards away. This may be a spot that I get my big boy at this fall. Another thing you want to look for in these monozone areas are essentially what I like to call dot to dot. And they're not necessarily these islands like this. What it can be just a series of particular trees. And I see this in northern Wisconsin a lot, especially in the big woods. And in this case, it might be semi-hardwoods, but you might have scattered spruce. So one particular spot I have up in northern Wisconsin is this particular woods is open hardwoods, but it has these scattered spruce. And what's kind of interesting is there's an area of scattered spruce that actually almost create like this line. And there's maybe 2 or 3 on each side. And this runs for maybe about 200 to 300 yards. And then it goes into this particular swamp. And this creates an abnormality within that particular woods. And what I like to do is I like to sit on either end of those essentially spruce. So what makes monozones so good? Well, primarily it's people. And I hate to say this, but when you hunt some of these public land areas and you hunt them long enough, like I have over the years, deer just know where people go. And these bigger bucks, okay, they know to just avoid people areas. And they like to just sit in these particular spots. Now, what I've noticed, though, in regards to these monozones, is that these deer, these bigger bucks, don't always sit directly in the middle of them. They're still somewhat on those edges. They can be in a little further. It can kind of depend upon the doe families. If you have more does within a particular monozone, that pushes those bucks deeper in for their bedding areas. So another easier way to explain this is let's just take a monozone and let's just create this square of the monozone. And we're just going to assume that it's like this swamp area back here. And it is going to be, we're going to make it small. We're going to make it 80 acres. Okay. And then around this particular monozone is going to be also other thick stuff. It's not going to be technically open hardwoods that would make a distinct edge. Okay. So that's really what I'm looking for as well. I'm looking for areas that look like garbage to everybody else, but doesn't have that true edge per se. Now, when I walk along and scout on a monozone, I'm looking for any little trail, whatever it might be, that comes out of it. And what I've noticed in these areas that have a lot of human pressure, it seems like these bucks don't leave a lot of sign. And what I'm looking for is anything that looks like a trail going into a thick area, into like stuff like this. And I'm going to maybe put a trail camera on that, or I may actually even just sit that particular trail that comes out of it. And I'm going to be sitting it into the monozone area just a little bit. I try not to be on the actual edge itself. What I've noticed is that these bigger bucks, what they'll even do is they will walk and edge, if they can, on the inside or the thick part of the monozone and not be into that little open area where a lot of people can see or be able to get a shot off, all right? A lot of times when you're hunting these monozone areas, okay, the reason these bucks are in here is because it's highly pressured all the way around. And they know that, and they're going to stay to that thick side, that area that gives them the most security cover. And that's how they like to move around in these monozone areas. So what do these monozones look like? Well, kind of the easiest way to find them is bring a hunting buddy with you when you do your scouting and see what they look for, what they are catching their eye. Because if it catches their eye, it's catching everybody else's eye as well. And we're talking in regards to public land. private land is different in regards to this, okay? So if you are applying this to private land, this may or may not pertain. But when it comes to public land, it's what everybody sees that looks good, and then whatever they don't see that looks bad, especially if it's thick, okay, and offers lots of security cover. That's what I'm usually referring to as garbage land, or in most cases, they turn out to be these monozones, okay? Little story. So I was scouting a particular property in northern Wisconsin, on public land with two buddies, and we're going through this cutover, and this cutover was already a couple of years old, and we had a river bottom along one side, and then where they did the cutover, they had all these little points that would stick out by this river bottom, and it just looked perfect. I mean, if you had to draw it up, that looked like that was the perfect spot. Then, to make matters worse, is the two guys were in front of me scouting or walking in this cutover, and they kick up a big buck, and it runs right down to the river bottom. So naturally, my two buddies claimed this particular area to bow hunt. And I'm like, okay, well, I know that there's big bucks in the area. We saw some really good sign, so on and so forth, and we kick up that big buck. So on the other side of the cutover, you're looking and all you see is this really thick pine and spruce, and it's thick underneath. And it didn't look like anything. And you pop it up on an aerial map, and it was just monotonous, went on for a very long ways. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go over there. I'm going to scout it out, looked it over. Nothing looked or popped out to me except one corner of this monozone. And in this particular corner, there was one trail that would come on that thick side or inside part of this monozone. And I'm like, you know what? This doesn't look too bad. It doesn't look the worst. And my buddies, they're all on the other end of that cutover down by that river bottom where those points coming out. Now, don't get me wrong. They would see, bucks down there. But I ended up getting two really nice bucks on this particular corner on this monozone. And when you looked at it from afar, it just didn't look like anything. And matter of fact, what I kind of notice now is when I drive around on public land, whether it be in northern Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, wherever it might be, I kind of always look for those spots on Onyx to see where public land is, and then I look to see what looks good, and then I look to see what looks not so good. And as I've been getting a little bit more older, you kind of get a little smarter with things, and I've been actually focusing a little bit more on these areas that really don't look like anything special, especially if they're thick and they're a bear to walk through. And that's what I've been kind of putting a little bit more focus on if it's a highly pressured public land area. Now, I do want to reiterate, if the particular property, okay, is big woods, public land, and you have little to no hunters, okay, back there, then go back to what I mentioned in a previous public land video, looking for a trifecta or trifectas, okay? The trifectas essentially are three different land topographies where they meet, and they would be essentially anti-monozones, okay? So monozones don't apply for everywhere across the board. They just seem to be the best when you have those areas of highly pressured public land. Another neat little component that you want to look for in a particular monozone is food source. Now, what you're looking at behind me is a cedar. This is a cedar tree that fell down, but if you look closely, I don't know if you can see it at all, but all of the cedar branches, or essentially the cedar leaves, if you want to call it that, have been cleaned off up to deer height, as high as they can reach. So what this does, it offers a late season food source for them. Deer love cedar, to eat cedar, when it becomes late season. So once again, these deer, if they're highly pressured, and when here in Wisconsin, they have to go through bow season, rifle season, muzzleloader season, and then back into archery season again. And these deer are constantly being pressured. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm quite a ways back in the swamp, but these cedars that I'm at right now offer a food source. Now, in a lot of cases, when I look at a lot of the cedars around here, especially behind me, you will notice that a lot of these cedar are cleaned off. But all it takes is a good windstorm here in fall, knock a couple cedar trees down, and then they have that late season food source. And then usually by springtime, you see that cedar tree that's been knocked down, it's picked clean. the time of year to hunt monozones. I don't really like early season for them. Your late pre-rut time frame to into the rut is usually the primary time, but where they really shine is late season. So if you hunt heavily pressured public land and you're looking for those late season spots, you know, these bucks know where everybody's walked, where everybody's been, and it pushes them way back into these monotonous garbage land areas. And then, well, folks, hopefully this gives you a little something to add to your repertoire, especially if you hunt public land, heavily pressured public land, and even heavily pressured private land in some situations. If you don't mind, hit that subscribe button. I'm also going to have my series starting here called Warriors of the Fall, and it's essentially going after these old warrior bucks, public land, small private land pieces that I have permission to hunt, and I do share some of these properties with other folks. You know, so these bucks, I would consider them to be warriors. Broadheads stuck in them, you know, after you get them, busted up legs, whatever it might be. These bucks on these heavily pressured properties are warriors. You have to have that warrior mentality, that warrior attitude, because it's not easy, especially when you hunt public land and those private land spots are highly pressured by your neighbors, and you just got to grind it out. So if you folks don't mind, once again, hit that subscribe button. These mosquitoes are bad, so you got to have a warrior mentality against these mosquitoes. But it should be a good fall, and I'm really looking forward to getting it done. As a matter of fact, I have one nice buck called Old Toad. That's the name I gave him, and he's #1 on the hit list. So maybe I can get him on camera and in the back of the truck. All right, until next time, Clint from Oak and Iron Outdoors.